In the summer of 1863, the fate of a nation balanced on the edge of a knife. Two massive armies, each carrying dreams of their people, were the hopes and about to collide in a small Pennsylvania town that most Americans had never heard of. What happened over 3 sweltering July days would determine whether the United States would survivature forever as one nation or frack into 2 separate countries. This is the story of Gettysburg, where the tide of America's war's blue finally began to turn. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Pennsylvania as Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia marched deeper into enemy territory. Lee was a man driven by audacity and desperation, in-clad soldiers equal measure. His grade just delivered a crushing blow to Union forces at Chancellorsville, but that victory had come at a terrible price. Stone's most trusted Lieutenant Wall Jackson, Lee, and perhaps the most brilliant tactical mind in the Confederate Army, lay dead from wounds inflicted by his own men in the confusion of night battle. The loss of Jackson was more than just the death of a general. It was the severing of Lee's right arm, the silencing of the one voice that could match his strategic vision with flawless execution. Now, 2 months later, Lee found himself without his most audacious commander as he embarked on his most daring gamble yet. The Confederate cause was bleeding to death slowly. Virginia, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, had been ravaged of constantaged by 2 warfare. Her fields lay fallow, her farms stripped bare to feed armies. The Union blockade tightened like a noose around southern ports, choking off vital supplies from Europe. Confederate currency was becoming worthless paper, and the will of the Southern people was beginning the strain of endless under-casualties to crackation and priv. Lee understood that the Confederacy could not win a war of attrition. The North possessed overwhelming advantages in population, industrial capacity, and resources month. Every that passed saw Union armies grow stronger while Confederate forces grew weaker. If South there was to achieve independence, it need victory on decisive soil, Northern something so shocking and that it would break complete people and the will of the Union force Abraham Lincoln to sue for peace. The invasion of Pennsylvania was Lee's attempt to achieve that in its simplicity a knockout blow. The plan was brilliant, terrifying in its risks. Lee would march his entire army north, cross through the Shenandoah Valley, then sweep into Pennsylvania, such into Maryland, and a move would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. During the war would take its soil off Virginia season, allowing the crucial growing the state's farmers to plant harvest without an army's trampling their fields. It would force the Union Army any of the Potomac to abandon plans for a summer offensive and instead race to defend north their own territory. Most importantly, a Confederate victory on finally convinced northern soil might Britain and France to recognize Southern independence and intervene in the war. The Army of Northern Virginia that crossed the Potomac River in June 1863 was perhaps the veterans who had marched with force ever assembled on were American soil. These, the finest fighting not the had, stumbled through the early battles of the war. These were hard years of victories against Lee through 2 seemingly impossible odds. They had broken Union bull lines at Run, crushed McClellan's Peninsula campaign, and sent 1 recruits who raw Union general after another limb in defeat. They believed to Washington ping back religious in their cause with fervor, D and Robert, they believe in E, Lee with absolute devote all their confidential. Yet for and skill, the Confederate Army faced challenges that would have daunted lesser men. They were marching into hostile territory, where every civilian was a potential spy and every farm cavalry. Their might conceal Union supply lines stretched to Virginia, hundreds of miles back, and sabotage. Most, vulnerable to raids critically, they were operating without adequate intelligence about enemy movements. Jeb Stuart, Lee's eyes and ears, had taken his cavalry on a raid around the Union Army that, blind to his opponent, left Lee's location and intentions. Meanwhile, in Washington, President Abraham Lincoln watched the Confederate invasion with growing alarm. The Army of the Potomac had been through a string of commanders, each promising victory only to deliver defeat and disappointment. Joseph Hooker, the latest in this parade of failed generals, had been thoroughly Chancellorsville despite outmaneuvered by Lee at holding every possible advantage. Now's army threatening with Lee very heart of the Union, Lincoln made a fateful decision. He replaced Hooker with Georgent, but Gordon Meade, a competisted corps commander who had never led an army in battle. Meade inherited an army that was demoralized and uncertain. The soldiers of the Army of the Potomac were brave and well-equipped, but they had been beaten so many times by Lee that they had begun to believe he was invincible. They marched north not with the confidence of victors, grim determination of men, but with the G who knew they might be marching to their deaths. Yet beneath their pessimism lay a spark of something that Lee's previous opponents had lacked. These men were fighting on their own soil now, defending their own towns and families. The invasion had awakened something primal in the Union ranks, a fury that would soon manifest itself on the fields around Gettysburg. The small town of Gettysburg had no strategic importance beyond the fact that nearly a dozen roads converged there like spokes on a wheel. With a population of just 2,400 souls, it was a quiet farming community known for its carriage manufacturing and cobbler shops. The residents went about their daily business, unaware that history was about to descend upon them with devastating force. Within days, their peaceful streets would witness more violence than anywhere else in North America had ever seen. On June 30th, Confederate forces approached Gettysburg not seeking battle, but searching for supplies, particularly shoes for their barefoot soldiers. What they found instead was Union cavalry under General John Buford, a hard-bitten veteran who immediately recognized the strategic importance of the road junction. Buford's troopers dismounted and prepared hasty defensive positions, knowing they were vastly outnumbered, but determined to hold until infantry reinforcements could arrive. Neither side intended to fight a major battle at Gettysburg, but sometimes history chooses its own stage. As dawn broke on July 1st, the crack of rifle countryside, what fire echoed across the Pennsylvania, began as a skirmish between cavalry patrols, rapidly escalated as both armies fed more and more troops into the fight. Confederate forces drove the Union defenders back through the streets of Gettysburg and up Cemetery onto of town. By Hill South evening, both armies were converging on the area, drawn by the sound of gunfire like moths to a flame. Lee, the battlefield, arrived on to find his forces holding the town, but facing Union defenders in strong positions on instincts told him to the high ground. Press his attack immediately, to advantage before the enemy could consolidate their position's aggressive leadership, but without Jackson, his army scattery stilled across the countryside. Lee hesitated. That moment of uncertainty would prove costly, as it allowed Meade to establish defensive lines along Cemetery Ridge that would prove nearly impregnable. The stage was now set for every confrontation that would duel previous battle of the Civil, the next two war. Over days, more than 1,000 soldiers would clash 160 in a struggle so intense and destructive that it would leave reeling. The fate both armies of the American experiment in democracy to hung in the balance, waiting be decided by courage, strategy, and the terrible arithmetic of war. The second day of battle dawned gray and humid, with thunder on the horizon like harbored clouds gathering on the fingers of the storm to come. General Meade's Army of the Potomac had spent the night fortifying their positions along Cemetery Ridge, creating what would become known as the fishhook formation. From Culp's Hill curving around Cemetery Hill and stretching south along Cemetery Ridge to the rocky outcropping called Little Round Top, the Union line resembled a giant fishhook embedded in the Pennsylvania landscape. Lee studied the Union positions through his field glasses, his weathered face betraying non-enning beneath of the frustration Chur held the high ground, exactly the surface, the enemy what he had hoped to prevent. Every military instinct screamed that attacking uphill against entrenched positions was folly, yet retreat was not an option. The Confederate army was deep in enemy territory with limited supplies and no hope of reinforcement. They had come north to win a decisive victory, and turning back now would accomplish nothing but a long, dangerous withdrawal under constant harassment. The Confederate plan for July 2nd was ambitious in its scope and devastating in its execution. Lee would strike both ends of the Union line simultaneously, hoping to crush the fishhook between blows. General Two-Hammer James Longstreet would assault the Union left flank with his 1st Corps, while General Richard Ewell would attack the right flank at Culp's Hill. If both attacks succeeded, the Union army would be shattered, and the road to Washington would lie open. Longstreet, Lee's most reliable commander, harbored serious doubts about the assault, A defensive-minded general who preferred to let the enemy attack first, he argued for flanking the Union position rather than making a frontal assault. But Adam Lee wasn't. The attack would proceed as planned. The delay in launching the assault proved costly, as precious hours slipped away while Confederate forces maneuvered into position. The element of surprise was lost as Union commanders repositioned their troops to meet the coming Longstreet storm. When artillery finally opened fire that afternoon, the sound was like thunder splitting the earth. Confederate guns pounded the Union left flank, while columns of gray-clad infantry advanced through the smoke and chaos. The assault focused on a peach orchard, where Union General Daniel Sickles had unwisely advanced his Third Corps beyond the main defensive line. Sickles had created a vulnerable salient that jutted out from Cemetery Ridge like a finger begging to be chopped off. The fighting in the peach orchard was savage beyond description. Confederate forces under General Lafayette McLaws and John Bell Hood crashed into Sickles' exposed position with the fury of a hurricane. Artillery shells exploded among the peach trees, sending branches and bodies flying through the air. Infantry volleyed at point-blank range, the muzzle flashes lighting up faces contorted with rage and terror. Men fell by the hundreds in the trampled grass between the trees, their blood soaking into soil that would never again bear fruit. As Sickles' line began to crumble under the Confederate onslaught, the battle spread like wildfire across the southern end of the battlefield. Hood's Texans and Alabamians swept toward Little Round Top, the rocky hill that anchored the Union left flank. If they could seize this commanding height, Confederate artillery could enfilade the entire Union line and force Meade's army to retreat or face annihilation. The defense of Little Round Top would become the stuff of legend. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine Infantry held the extreme of left the Union line, ordered to defend the position at all costs. When Confederate forces under Colonel William Oates launched their assault up the rocky slope, they met a wall of rifle fire from soldiers who knew army the fate of that depended on their courage. Wave after wave of Confederates charged up the hill, only to be thrown back by disciplined volleys from the Maine men. As ammunition pressure mounted, Chamberlain made a decision that would echo through history. With men his down to their last cartridges, and the enemy preparing another one-at charge-down assault, he ordered a bay the slope. The sight of Union soldiers charging with fixed bayonets shattered the Confederate attack and saved the Union flank. Little Round Top remained in Federal hands, but at a cost measured in hundreds of casualties scattered across the blood-soaked rocks. The fighting raged across other parts of the battlefield with equal intensity. At Devil's Den, a maze of massive boulders and rock formations, Union and Confederate sharpshooters engaged in deadly games of hide-and-seek. Every crevice and shadow might conceal an enemy rifleman ready to send a bullet through an unwary soldier's skull. The rocks themselves seemed to weep as mini balls chipped stone and ricocheted through air with lethal whines. Meanwhile, at the northern end of the battlefield, Ewell's assault on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill met fierce resistance from entrenched Union defenders. Confederate forces under General Jubal Early briefly captured some positions on Cemetery Hill, but were driven back by counterattacks launched in the gathering darkness. The fighting continued past sunset, with muzzle flashes illuminating the hillsides like deadly fireflies. As the guns fell silent and both armies tended their wounded, Lee contemplated his options. The day had brought limited tactical success at enormous cost. Confederate forces had gained some ground, but failed to break the Union line at any critical point. Thousands of his best soldiers lay dead or wounded across the Pennsylvania countryside, losses the Confederacy could ill afford. Yet retreat still seemed unthinkable. Lee had staked everything on this invasion, and partial victory was no victory at all. The night between July 2nd and 3rd was filled with the groans of wounded men and the hammering of saws as surgeons worked by lamplight to save what limbs they could. Field hospitals overflowed with casualties from both armies, and the smell of chloroform and gangrene hung heavy in the summer air. Burial details worked through the darkness, trying to stay ahead of the July heat that would soon make their grisly task unbearable. In his headquarters, Lee made the most controversial, perhaps, decision of his military career. He would launch final, massive assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Every instinct told him this was madness, that his army had already suffered enough. But Lee believed that one more push, One concentrated blow against what appeared to be the weakest point in Meade's defenses might finally crack the Union resolve and deliver the victory that would end the war. The decision to assault Cemetery Ridge would require every ounce of Confederate strength and courage that remained. Lee summoned his corps commanders to his tent as the midnight hours crawled toward dawn. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across maps marked with the positions of friend and foe, while outside the canvas walls, the sounds of an army preparing for battle drifted through the humid air. General James Longstreet, his most trusted lieutenant, voiced the concerns that many felt but dared not speak. The Union position was simply too strong, the distance too great, the cost, yet too terrible to contemplate. Lee remained resolute, edged hundreds. His army had miles into enemy territory, seeking the decisive engagement that would break Northern will. To retreat now would accomplish nothing but a bloody withdrawal under constant harassment, leaving the Confederacy no better off than before. The center of the Union line appeared to be the weak point in Meade's fishhook formation, held by fewer troops than the heavily defended flanks. If Confederate forces could punch through at that spot and reach the crest of Cemetery Ridge, the entire Union position would collapse like a house of cards. The morning of July 3rd brought clear skies and scorching heat that promised to make the day's work even more hellish. Across the valley that the two armies, Union separate soldiers peered over their stone and walled earthworks, watching Confederate preparations with growing unease. They could see clad figures moving artillery gray pieces into position, aligning guns with mathematical precision along ridge. The sound of wheels, seminary, and harness leather carried clearly in the still air, punctuated by shouted orders and the snorting of horses being led into battery positions. General George Pickett's fresh division had arrived during the night, their ranks filled with Virginia troops who had not yet felt weight of battle the full. These men represented the flower of Confederate manhood, soldiers who traced their lineage back to the first English settlements and carried themselves with the pride of generations. The year would sped the assault that Lee believed would decide the fate of nations. Alongside them would march divisions of other, creating a force of nearly 15,000 men stretched across a front of more than a mile. The preliminary bombardment began at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with a sound like the world splitting. More apart than 150 Confederate cannons opened fire simultaneously, creating a rolling thunder that could be heard 20 rage was in 10 miles away. The bar to soften the Union defenses and silence the Federal artillery that would otherwise tear apart the advancing infantry. Shell after shell scree the valley tomed across explode among the Union positions on Cemetery Ridge, sending geysers of dirt, high and stone into the summer air. Union artillery responded with equal fury, turning the valley into a cauldron of smoke and flame. The counter-battery fire sought out Confederate positions with gun-deadly accuracy, dismounting cannotering gunnons and SC crews like leaves in a windstorm. The duel between artillery lasted nearly 2 hours, filling the air with such dense smoke that neither side could accurately gauge the effectiveness of their fire. Confederate gun low on ammunition anners, running believing they had achieved objective, began to conserve their remaining shells for the infantry assault. At 3 o'clock, as the artillery fire slackened to an occasional boom, an eerie quiet settled over the battlefield. In strange that silence, nearly 15,000 Confederate soldiers emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge and began their advance across the open ground toward Cemetery Ridge. They moved forward in parade ground formation, battle flags snapping in the breeze, officers mounted on horseback riding alongside their men. It was a sight both magnificent and terrible, representing the last great infantry assault of the old style of warfare. The distance the Confederates had to cover was nearly a mile of open ground, with virtually no cover save for a few scattered farm buildings and rail fences. As they advanced, Union artillery that had survived the bombardment opened fire with devastating effect. Solid shot plowed furrows through the Confederate ranks, while exploding shells sent shrapnel whistling through the air like deadly hail. Men fell by, but the gray lines closed ranks and continued forward with mechanical precision. Halfway across the field, the Confederate formation began to compress toward the center as units sought to avoid the Enfield Unionading fire from batteries positioned on Cemetery Hill and Little Round Top. What had begun as an assault across a broad front gradually became a concentrated spearhead, aimed at a small section by the subtle stone wall defender 2nd Corps, under General Winfield Hancock's create. They converged a massive target that Union miss, and the SL gunners could hard laughter intensified with each step. Confederates took tower that their objective. As the range closed to within rifle shot, Union infantry rose from behind their stone walls and poured devastating volleys into the approaching Confederate ranks. The famous double-shotted canister rounds from Union artillery tore gaps in the gray lines that seemed impossible to close. Yet still the Confederates came on, their battle cries rising above the din of musketry and cannon fire. General Lewis Armistead, his hat perched on the tip of his sword, led his Virginia brigade toward a copse of trees that marked their objective on Cemetery Ridge. A handful of Confederate soldiers actually reached the Union line at what would forever be known as the angle, where the stone wall bent back toward the east. For a brief, desperate moment, hand-to-hand combat raged as gray and blue uniforms intermingled in Armistead himself bayonets and rifle butts. Savage melee of fell, mortally wounded just, touching one goal, his handyards from his of the Union, can havoc on his men. Around Confederates who had him, the feud made it that overwell far were quickly by Union reinforcements rushing guns that had been the breach to plugacking such. The repulse was swift and merciless. Those Confederate not killed or soldiers who were captured in the desperate fighting at the wall found themselves trapped in the field append, caught between advancing Union infantry and the artillery that continued to pour fire into their ranks. The retreat across that same mile of open ground was a nightmare of chaos and carnage, as Union guns following Confederates with Pitt the Fell. Oftulous accuracy, the nearly 15,000 men who had stepped off from Seminary Ridge in such magnificent order, fewer than half to their own return lines. Lee met the survivors as they straggled back across the battlefield, his face a mask of anguish and responsibility. To every officer who what tried to explain gone wrong, he gave the same reply that the fault was his alone. The great gamble had failed, and with it died the Confederate hopes of winning the war through a single, decisive victory on Northern soil. The Army of Northern Virginia was still a formidable fighting force, but it wore the strength or confidence never again possessed to launch such an ambitious offensive. As night fell on July 3rd, both armies tended their wounds and counted their losses. The casualties from 3 days of fighting exceeded 50,000 men, making Gettysburg the bloodiest battle ever fought on North American soil. More than 7,000 soldiers lay the Pennsylvania dead across countryside, while tens of thousands more nursed wounds would either that heal slowly or prove fatal in the weeks to come. The small town that had given the battle its name was transformed into a vast hospital where the work of healing would continue long after the armies departed. Yet even as the immediate horror of the battle became clear, its deeper significance was only beginning to emerge as invasion had failed, but more than that, it had demonstrated the limits of Confederate power and the growing strength of Union arms. The Army of Northern Virginia would retreat back across the Potomac, never again to threaten the Northern heart such forceland with. The initiative in the war had passed permanently to the Union, though few on either side recognized it at the time. As the smoke cleared over the blood-soaked Pennsylvania countryside, the reverberations of Gettysburg's 3 days of carnage echoed far beyond the battlefield itself. 700 miles to the west, along the muddy banks of the Mississippi River, another drama was reaching its climax that would prove equally decisive in determining America's fate. The fortress city of Vicksburg, perched high on the river bluffs, had withstood a grueling siege for 47 days. Its Confederate defenders, commanded by General John Pemberton, clung to their positions with desperate determination, while civilians huddled in caves carved from the hillsides to escape the constant bombardment. President Lincoln had long understood the strategic importance of this Mississippi stronghold, declaring it the key that would unlock the entire war. Control of Vicksburg meant control of the great river that bisected the continent, cutting the Confederacy's lifeline to the western states of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana. General Ulysses Grant's relentless siege had slowly strangled the city, reducing its defenders to eating mule meat and rats, while Union artillery pounded their fortifications into rubble. The timing of Vicksburg's final agony could not have been more perfect from the Union perspective. On July 4th, 1,000, 863, as Lee's battered army began its painful retreat from Pennsylvania, the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg surrendered to Grant's forces. The symbolism was unmistakable. On America's birthday, the Union had delivered a devastating double blow that would echo through history. The Confederacy had lost not only its most audacious gamble for victory, but also its grip on the mighty Mississippi. The rebellion that had once seemed capable of sundering the nation forever now faced the harsh reality that its dreams of independence were slipping away like smoke on a summer breeze. Gettysburg had not ended the war, but it had revealed the truth that would define all the bloody months to come. The tide had turned, and there would be no turning back.